Season 3 of The Handmaid's Tale was perhaps the show at its darkest and most intense. I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with costume designer Natalie Bronfman. Natalie, you took the reins as costume designer from Emmy-nominated Anne Crabtree. You were both nominated together twice. Is it particularly challenging to take the reins and further develop the show's look, which is already so distinct?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. But in order to answer your question, I had big shoes to fill, put it that way. It was quite a big task. The saving grace was that the story was then continuing on into a new city, which was Washington. So there was a new world to create. Of course, there's a progression then of the costumes. And as we got to Washington, because it was more pious, there were more other costumes that had to be created, as well as an army, and just an entire different way of lifestyle. There's a gala, and the characters are evolving as well. In the modern world that we saw in Canada, we were exploring them a little bit and following them with their, I want to say, psychology that they had to deal with the trauma. And I was trying to bring that forth with the costumes that they were wearing on a daily basis.
Yeah, let's talk about episode 6, Household, because it was a real confronting highlight of the season. It's when the show this past season really ramps up, because up till then we had really only spent time in Boston, and we hadn't been to Washington, where Gilead is kind of turned up to 11, and a lot of that has to do with the costumes, a lot of it. And give us some examples of the different things that you were doing to make this regime look so zealous and pious and extreme.
Well, for starters, with the commanders, they had an army that we hadn't seen before. And their uniforms specifically, they were sort of a derivation of First World War France, the Prussian army during the Franco-Prussian War in terms of shape, and the color I took from the fascists because of the austerity of the regime and the controlling that they wanted to do with all the people that were there. You could see it specifically in the train station when the young men were off to war. It was, I had many commentary from the people in the actual set saying it reminds them very much of Second World War when the young men went off. So.
Wow. Yeah, like thinking about the commanders' costumes or uniforms, there's a beautiful one that Joseph Fiennes' character wears with the ropes around his arm. And when we're usually used to seeing epaulets or ribbons or things like that, but this one's really austere, as you say. To me, it looked funereal. Were you going for that vibe as well?
Well, the roping was something that Anne had come up with from the first season. And we would introduce white and black ropes depending on the situation and the scene. For example, there was a benediction of the children where we had, I think, about 800 background plus cast. And because he had just lost his daughter to Canada, he was the only commander who had a black rope on, whereas all the rest of them wore the white ones because they were celebrating the children. So that's how we could play with the
color. We'll talk a little bit about color later, because I think this show is a great example of how color palette really drives the narrative. But before we do, let's stick to Household, because I was very confronted by something that would appear to be so simple, and that was the masks worn over the handmaids' faces, and then the rings, which I think, I'm not really sure whether that's a makeup thing or a costume thing, but it's all part of the look and feel of the show. It reminded me of Saudi Arabia or a regime where women were subjugated even more so. Talk us through that element, because it's simple, but it was extremely effective.
Well, actually, it wasn't a Middle Eastern reference. There, the handmaid's reference, as well as the aunts, came from a nun's wimple. Typically, the underdressing covers everything but the face.
Yeah.
And because the handmaids already had their wings on, they literally didn't have much real estate in terms of flesh that was visible anymore, except their faces. The only thing left that they had was literally their voice, which then in Washington was being taken away as well. Hence the covering of the closing of the lips, which is actually a props thing. And we had an amazing props team. Yeah. So the rings would seal the lips shut, and then the rest of it was visually then gone. because lips are actually quite sensual. And actually, when you're angry and you flare your nostrils, you can still be quite expressive. So I had to leave a little bit for the actors in order to be able to express themselves as well. The other thing that I had done with the veils, we called them veils, for the handmaids, is at the back I had attached what were fur hooks. Now, fur hooks are very heavy duty, and when you snap them shut, they actually make a noise. And there's one point where Aunt Lydia gives to June her veil, and you can hear the snapping shut of this veil. And it is sort of a reminder that you are in shackles now. And that's what I was playing on, not only visually, but also so you could hear that there's a true shackle on their face now. You've been shut.
Wow. Yeah, that didn't really occur to me, but it did subliminally. And that's half the battle, is those little nuances that each department is using or employing to drive the narrative. And for the costumes, I was also wondering, has the Handmaid's attire, how has it developed over the last 3 seasons? Have you kept it quite consistent to season 1, or has there been a lot of changes to it to move the story forward?
Well, the actual dress, the base dress and cape are the same. But once we got to Washington, because the only other flesh that was visible was the décolleté, that's why June was given a capelet to cover that up when they were doing the promotional video, the propaganda video that they were then going to release to Canada. And it was also going to be shown in Washington. And Fred so desperately wants to be in Washington amongst the big boys. So he wants to show them what a pious house he has. And hence he gives her this capelet, which covers up what is left of flesh.
Yeah, that's really important to the Fred character, because as Joseph likes to call him, he's a really pathetic person who is desperate for approval and desperate to move forward in this world. And that's one of the ways to do it, to subjugate June even further. Another really great element from Household is obviously the volume of handmaids that we see.
Yeah.
And I was wondering when I first watched it, is this CGI or did you actually have to dress all these people?
We had about 350 handmaids, and we had only had in stock about 60 from the first 2 seasons. So we built spats and capes and dresses, and it took us 11 hours to build one dress. So you can imagine. Then there are overdresses and overskirts, and then little sleevelets that go over that. And then plus we had to build all the veils that were new. Plus there were also new aunts. There was the army. There were more guardians, more commander wives. Everyone had their own special veiling as well, which was sort of, I took a little bit from every religion so that no one was singularly offended. This way I offended everyone a little bit.
Yeah, equally.
You know?
Yeah,
was,
equal opportunity offender. That's perfectly fine.
That's the way they work.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the scope of the costume work on the show generally before we move into a few more specifics that occurred to me, and that is the colour palette. Obviously, this is work that you and Anne had done throughout season 1 and 2 that you were continuing over season 3, but I felt like season 3 was even more distinct in its colour palette, and maybe that's because of the way it was shot. But the example is like the commander wives, the commanders, the guardians, the aunts, the handmaids, the little girls. They all have their own specific colour, and it's very strict. Talk us through the point of why that is the case on this show.
Well, originally Margaret Atwood had set sort of in motion that color palette, and then Anne worked with the Reed Morano in the first episode and the very first season premiere together. They had worked together and discussed what would work nicely together and so on. What I did in season 3, specifically with Fred and Serena's character arc, is with Serena. Not only did I change her shapes from bigger, tighter to wider to indicate sort of where she was in her mind, but also with the tonality of her teal. It started out very dark and somber because of where she was and having lost the child, and then moving into slowly the shapes became tighter as she became stronger. Going back into Washington, when we went to Washington, we went back into the 1950s obedient housewife shape in Household, because she was trying to emulate what they were doing there, because they were far more obedient in her mind and sort of in appearance. after she sees at the gala. That's not the case necessarily. To once she goes back and then she leads Fred astray, you can see in the costuming through the tailoring, whether it's darts or chevrons or shoulders or necklines, and then the color kept getting lighter and like brighter and brighter for her because she was growing in strength, in lightness. Sort of she became the sun all of a sudden. And Fred went from being in this total black suit to being a lighter and lighter and lighter gray until he's in his lightest when they're at the bread and breakfast, because he's all, everything is good now, and she's misleading him completely. And then when he gets arrested, he's in his darkest suit again. So he falls back into it. So it's this, I'm playing with the tonality of that.
It's so intentional, and people when they're stuck in the emotional narrative of the show are not necessarily realizing it, but a lot of it, as we said earlier, is so subliminal, and it's just something that we're taking on subconsciously. Another really great example is the little girls in their light pink pastel colors. That is not an accident. There's a reason for why I think you've chosen those colors. Talk us through that element.
Well, they were excuse me, they were young girls and young handmaids in training. There was a bit of a gray area because we were never really sure where they all came from and who decided one was going to become an Econo woman or a Martha so that was something that perhaps they'll work out this season, like really specifically, but they were young girls and they were not handmaids yet, so they weren't menstruating yet. So it was sort of a lighter version of this fertility color, let's say.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is the red, this on the third season, went from being just a breeder and a vessel to receive and give out a child to then turning that into a powerful, it's anger, it's fire, I'm going to burn it to the ground. Sort of subliminally, the color changes. Specifically, once June kills Commander Winslow at the brothel, she has to put the dress back on, but it's changed its significance. It's no longer a subjugation. It's a disguise now because she has to pretend to still be a handmaid, even though she's not anymore.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. And then when I'm watching an episode like episode 9, Heroic, which is the episode in the hospital, it's a very starkly lit, white, bright set. Your costumes then are even more noticeable, and the color palette is accentuated. I noticed that one of the commander wives who was looking over off Matthew had a very dark blue attire while Serena still had her lighter teals. Was that intentional?
Yes, it was. She was sort of the old guard, and she was a lesser important commander wife. And also Serena was sort of really coming into her power. Hence her shape was also very close to the body. There was no, they didn't have that sort of 50s skirt shape anymore, the circle skirts. It all became close and tight like an armor.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, and it was so noticeable because obviously the set was so white, so we were looking for those colours. You could see the little girls walking past the window. June had her red outfit on. I wanted to also talk about how the handmade design, which, as you say, is something that Anne developed for the first season, that you obviously were very important in terms of the way the costumes worked over season 1 and 2. How do you feel about how that design is so important and iconic in pop culture? Did you ever expect to see it at protests and as a symbol for the rise against misogyny? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a very powerful symbol, and you cannot ignore a sea of women in red. I want to say it's almost a Gandhi-esque way of resistance. It's not an outward action, it's just a presence. And sometimes silence can be so much more deafening than outward action. That's sort of how I see it. And also when you see so many of them together, when I remember when we were shooting, excuse me, in Washington, I sat on a park bench at lunchtime when the girls were going to drop off their capes, to go and then go for lunch. And they didn't know who I was. And I was just observing and watching them, and I could hear the conversations. And everything I heard was just, wow, this is so powerful. I can't believe we're part of this. I can't believe it's part of history now. And I thought, you know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. this is a movement now that has brought to forefront all of this misogyny and women's rights that are not only in the United States being, played around with in terms of what we're allowed to do. This is from all over the world, and not just in first world countries. So.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me as well. The power of costuming. People a lot of the time do not understand that saying about clothes maketh the man is actually incredibly powerful for on all pop culture that we consume. The other thing that I was going to talk to you about was how you are obviously designing on a contemporary show, although The Handmaid's Tale is dystopian and fantasy, and it's not quite our contemporary world, but it is still contemporary. It's not period. What are your thoughts on how there's a bias in the costuming world where a lot of people assume that great costuming is most costuming and they don't necessarily view the challenges of contemporary costuming and how difficult it can be?
I think the best kind of costuming is when it complements the character without taking over, and it becomes a seamless blend, an extension, I want to say, of the acting, of the character arc. There's a lot of thought put into modern clothes, specifically for our 3 refugees that we had, Luke, Moira, and Emily. There's lots of research that went into that, lots of trauma research that went into that. And then I like to read a lot about psychology as well, so I could delve into symbolism of colors and shapes and how someone with trauma would dress themselves once all of a sudden they're given autonomy again, which they haven't had for so long. For example, with Emily, that's the immediate one we see right there. Yeah. Moira had already been around a bit, and she's got a bit of a, well, screw you attitude. And so her color palette is a bit more of a vibrancy in it, yet it's still not over the top that takes away from her, her character, her acting. Luke, on the other hand, is a man who feels completely impotent in the fact that he cannot help his daughter and wife, and he's not going to think about what shirt am I going to wear today, or so he's so busy gathering information, he just wants to help and fix it. So he's not going to be worried about, and he's not going to have a new coat or cloak or sweater or shirt on every single day and not be a fashion palette. So those are the sort of things you have to take into consideration of if someone is traumatized or if someone is happy, or how are they expressing that through clothing.
Yeah, see, again, it's...
I look at my friends as well when they're having good times and bad times, or myself, or family members. Like, for example, even with Eleanor Lawrence, in her in and out of dementia, just her shapes of her clothing, as she was sliding further in, when you're in that sort of state, you don't change your clothes, you don't wash, you don't eat, and you often get thinner and thinner. So we actually made the dresses ever so slightly larger, that it looked like she was swimming in them a little bit. So there's all these little small things that we were doing, or the things she would wrap around herself. One of them was like a fishnet, and she stuck her fingers through it, this crocheted shawl we made. But it was binding her, but it was also giving her security. So it's all
so interesting. It's just so fascinating to me that the different elements of the show and how intentional they are. And I got to try to pay more attention. I love it. I just love it. Final question is about the Emmys. You were nominated twice for season 1 and 2. Take us back to the highlight of being nominated by the Academy. It's a huge honor.
Oh, absolutely. I was completely shocked. And it was great. I mean, I went the first 2 seasons I was on as supervisor by accident, actually. Long story, I knew Anne from about a decade ago, and I was on another Margaret Atwood show, actually, Alias Grace. And then when she came to do this show, she asked me to come aboard. I was sort of the assistant designer, buyer. We weren't really sure yet. And then the supervisor ended up leaving. So wow. There you go.
And the rest is history.
Yeah, I sort of ended up, so I was right there from the very beginning of it, from the very first fitting, the first fitting with Lizzie, Lizzie Moss as very first fitting for that. So it was nice because I know the entire story. It was just sort of a seamless continuation when I stepped in. So
Yeah, it's lovely, and hopefully we'll see you back at the Emmys for nomination 3. We could only hope. But in the meantime, Natalie, thank you so much for your insight today. It's really, really interesting to hear from artisans on our favourite shows and the intentionality of their work. Appreciate your time today.
well, thank you so much for having me.
Now, everyone, go to Gold Derby, make your predictions, click subscribe, and watch all of our great contender chats, just like this one with Natalie.